Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Ellen Corcella, author of a new book titled Walk With Me, A Journey Through the Landscape of Trauma. Ellen spent 10 years as a hospital chaplain, caring for the critically ill, injured, and dying patients and their families. Ellen writes and speaks about the intricate relationships between faith, spirit, trauma, and resilience. Aiming to unearth pathways for deeper faith integration and heightened resilience in times of adversity, she urges us to embody love, mercy, courage, and hospitality. After graduating from Christian Theological Seminary, Ellen received additional training in trauma-informed clinical care, mind-body medicine, and palliative care. She's an ordained minister with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and serves as an elder and social justice minister at her local congregation. Prior to her ministry, Ellen was a New York City prosecutor for 20 years. During that time, she prosecuted mobsters, murderers, narcotics traffickers, and other violent criminals. Ellen graduated from Georgetown University Law Center and George Washington University. You can learn more about Ellen and her work at ellencorcella.com. So Ellen, welcome, and it's so great to have you
Thank
here to
you.
talk about your book.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's great to be talking to you. And um, I used to, I've listened to interview after interview, and now I'm here, but it's great. Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful. You've made a great, progression through your writing journey. So we'll talk about that. So is there anything else that you'd like people to know about you?
Oh, I think, well, that was a lot, but I think, uh, personally, I think it's important to know that I actually am from immigrant parents. I think that's important in this time. I don't necessarily look like it, but I'm a first generation Italian in this country. My father came from Italy, and my mother's parents came from Ireland. So I'm two generations back, right back to Ireland, and my daughter is adopted from China. So there's that sort of part that informs some of what I do, and then of course my faith journey was anchored really early. I guess coming from Italy and Ireland, and we were sort of what you would call beyond cradle Catholics. I mean, it was like really deeply embedded into it. And so I went to Catholic schools, and um, uh, I felt very I was very, it ends up, if you read the book, that faith piece becomes something that's very important to me and useful in terms of having a space of encouragement and purpose. So it's always, it's interesting how it influences you the rest of your life to have that type of grounding.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when I first learned about you and your book, I thought to myself, well, this would be a great book for chaplains. But then I started reading it, and I realized it's really a great book for anyone who is trying to overcome experiences with trauma or knows someone who's trying to overcome experience with trauma.
Mhm.
But then as I went further into it, I thought to myself, okay, well, this book should be read by everyone because it's so important, the different
Absolutely.
things that you touch on. It's universally applicable. And you do it in such a way that is vulnerable, it's educating, it's very, very helpful, I think. So I really hope that the book does very, very well.
Thank you. Thank you
So
very much.
yeah, yeah. Well, no, I don't say that kind of thing to people very often, but I really believe
Mhm.
that. It's like you learn how trauma affects everyone. Um,
Mhm.
so, as I said, the title of it is Walk With Me, A Journey Through the Landscape of Trauma. So tell folks a little bit about how that book came about.
Yeah, it's really funny because if you have a career as a prosecutor like I did, people always saying, why don't you write stories about your cases? And I never, it never felt like that's what I wanted to do, right? I'd always laugh and say, sure. But at some point in my second year of chaplain training, um, the experiences I was having both with patients, the transformational experiences I was having in my faith journey, I thought I had no idea that this is what chaplains do. I was like everybody else. They go in and they pray, but who knew? And it's all done in private, right? Um, you're not a pastor. You're not doing worship every time. You're not performing rituals like baptism and that's how it sort of started. I wanted people to know, and then I kind of wanted people to know how you learn to be a chaplain, right? Because there was a lot of books. There's academic books, there's case study books, but there was no book that really, in my sense, I wanted to write the book that I wanted to have as a chaplain. So that's kind of how it started, was the desire to write about the transformation and to write about what I was learning, which was just blowing my mind about trauma and trauma-informed care. So that's how the started to nudge me, and I wanted to get that out.
But in the book, you are very vulnerable, in sharing, your own story and history and the trauma that you went through. And I know, having spoken with, many other authors writing about their own past, it's very cathartic, and
Yeah,
helpful for the author to go through that, even though it may not feel like it.
yes, right, right.
Is that the way you felt too?
Oh, absolutely. There were so the writing about myself in that way sort of developed along the way. I mean, one of the critical things that happened is it's kind of outlined in the book, but I entered any profession not wanting to talk about my trauma. That's what traumatized people. That's the last thing they
Sure,
want to talk about
sure.
often, and I really kind of made a talent out of it. But there comes a point when you're being in training, you continually asked to share what's happened to you and do your own self-examination. It's part of the process of learning how to be with others in their crisis. And someone referred me to Henry Nouwen's Wounded Healer, because I'd always thought that my wounds were not something I should share because I thought it displayed a weakness, or it might have been my fault. All the stuff traumatized people think, right? And that I could just move beyond it. And I pick up this book, and I don't know, it's a pretty simple book, but it like blew not my mind open, but my heart, like how he talks about this one young man who can't get it when he's trying to deal with a man who's going to kind of lose no matter what operation he has and stuff. And that notion that our wounds become like our own sacred vessel, that they're not, I put a quote in the book, but our wounds are like the Grand Canyon. There's a cut in the earth, but a source of inexhaustible beauty. I must have read that book. I've read that book dozens and dozens of times now.
Wow.
And
Wow.
that is how I began to have to understand these wounds. And then that's how the editor and I really began to say, you have to include what happened to you as part of this book, because it explains so much of how you're responding to these patients. It explains so much of why there's transformation happening with you, and it explains why the trauma. So I'm my own, sort of explains why trauma-informed care is working for you, right? But if people don't know what happened to you before, and so then for a period of a year or two, it became like, if all I do is write this book for myself, I will have healed through this in many ways. Stories were coming up. I had to face them. I cried during, some of the writing or reading stories back to myself. But I knew, partly it's what I was learning about writing memoir, but it had to be genuine, right? So what was hard was not the story, but the versions of the story where I was still being defensive, or I wanted to defend myself, or, who is the bad actor in this story, when there's really the sad part about all of this is there's no bad actor. It's bad circumstances, and coming to terms with them, right? And so I have to edit it. Sometimes I have to put away for a while and then come back to the story until I felt that the story was was vulnerable, and I wasn't being defensive or angry, but I was just telling the real truth, partly truths I hadn't told myself, if that
Well, I
makes
think that's
sense.
part of the reason why it's so effective in such a good book is because of that vulnerability and because of, the practicality with which you present that and,
Hmm.
the rest of the things that you describe. So thank you
Hmm.
for
Hmm. Yeah, sure.
Um,
No.
so, as you well know, and other folks know, I've worked with lots of different authors and advised them kind of on
Hmm.
a marketing strategy, things like that. And, also with publishing houses that tell me they don't want to see memoirs, right? That's
Right.
not a popular genre these days. And so they talk about, crafting it instead into a narrative nonfiction that's focused on a particular topic with a person's personal story woven into it, which I think is a very good
Mhm.
strategy. It's like, people don't care about Ellen, but they care about trauma, right? I mean,
Right.
you know, right?
Right.
So, I think it just makes a whole lot of sense on multiple levels. So, um, is that kind of part of the transition that you kind of made?
Yes, and I had taken your courses, so I knew people didn't like memoirs. So um, but in thinking about this, I think because I never was just going to write about my life. I didn't start out trying to write about my life. It's just that the story intersected with my life, right? So I was integral part of the story. So when I try to describe it, I'd say it's a memoir, but really I started by the way I said before, which is I wanted other people to know about, not about trauma. There are plenty of memoirs that start with these big traumatic events. It was about the transformational possibilities with this new understanding of neurobiology, the new psychological understandings they were coming to, um, the newer techniques for approaching traumatized people, and the faith transformations that
Mm.
I couldn't believe it. Chaplains could walk in a room and people wanted to talk to chaplains. People wanted to talk about their faith. People wanted to um, have someone to it was like a perpetual confessional. If you're Catholic, you know what I'm
Mm.
saying by that, but in a good way, right? It was interactive. So I think now, because I started out with a thematic approach, all the stories I was selecting were about the theme, were about trauma. And I was very careful. The stories are carefully selected to then illustrate a theme about this arc of trauma. So even the book's arc, right? It's not about me. Ellen grew up and then she decided she wanted to be a prosecutor and then she decided she wanted to do this.
Right.
It's about the book, the 5 sections are deliberately made to show an arc of how one's life might be in trauma. So it's trauma, the imposition of trauma, what trauma looks like, what trauma does, faith, how we begin to have some construction or seeds of meaning and purpose, right? Then there's struggle. The consequences of trauma is when you grow up, it's hard and you find yourself, uh, despite all appearances of perhaps being successful, because I was, these lingering effects of loneliness and disruption and disorientation continue. And then the fourth is transition, like, oh, how do we begin to create a new narrative about ourselves? And, and I really wanted a book that helped others, right? I didn't want a memoir that's just about me. I love Mary Carr, but it's 5 books about her. I wanted a book that said, this is about me, but not because of me. I want you to know
Yeah.
what are the pieces that can transform us. And I didn't want to write it in a 10 steps towards healing, right? I don't believe in those books. And
Yeah.
renewal,
Yeah.
like, so the 5 sections are designed to take you through an arc of what each, whether you read a medical journal or you read, the steps towards trauma healing, you can read all that stuff, but it was all the stories were to fill in that arc and to have the reader go through that arc and hopefully feel like they got something out of it in the end. I'm just not telling you about how miserable my life was, because it was. I mean, it could sound like it, but it wasn't. But more about how remarkable, both faith-wise through Henry Nouwen, we can transform this into a catalyst of being good human beings to each other, and how trauma-informed care understanding that we can embrace the traumatized other in a safe way and not hurt them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I
Well,
think that's what it was.
to me, it kind of read like a novel because I kept wanting to go to the next chapter to see what was going to happen next, but in a way that wasn't hyperbolic or over the top or anything like that. But
Mm-hmm.
how do you feel like you achieved that kind of aspect of it?
That was very intentional. When I first talked to my developmental editor, I said I want it to be fast. Part of that was because traumatized people, things happen fast all the time, right? You don't have time to, it was kind of to replicate a little bit of what's going on in
Mm,
the emergency room, what's
mm,
going on with surgeons. So that was my first instinct. And two, I didn't want it to be a memoir that kind of was a little bit slow. So I had to learn as a trial lawyer, you already understand sort of story arc, right? Whatever people think or see on TV, a trial lawyer needs to have a story arc and needs to know how to put relevant evidence in. What I needed to learn were the techniques, which is why
mm,
I listened a lot about just people promoting fiction books.
mm.
And I learned techniques, both in terms of how you write a sentence, alliteration. There's something where you repeat the vowel sounds within a sentence. But also I paid a lot of attention after I got the stories that would go in any given chapter. I paid a lot of attention to learning about reflection, but how to transfer from one chapter to another.
Mhm, mhm.
And so I learned some interesting things about, so I always end the chapter with kind of like, oh, this wasn't going to be the last time I was going to hear about this, right? And then the reader's compelled to go,
Yeah, yeah.
I was right. I wasn't the last time, and so you learn to lead some of the last sentences into the next sentences. And I always made sure there was a story that kind of, you don't know what the ending is going to be. I didn't know what the ending was going to be when it was happening. So, and I love mysteries. So I'd read, hundreds of mysteries, right, my whole life. So I just felt if this book was going to work, I needed people to want to read it. And
Mhm.
most people like to read novels and mysteries,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
that, but you have to learn some of these techniques if you don't know them.
So there's
Yeah.
one sentence in your book that quotes a therapist named Jenny who says the following:
Mm-hmm.
Your parents were the adults responsible for their own actions. You don't need to protect them. You don't need to carry their shame. It's their baggage. Give them back their suitcases. So I just loved that advice. I thought it was very well said, very meaning for me personally, and I suspect that it will be for many other people.
Okay. Yeah. One little funny story about this after this book came out. And so my neighbor across the street got it and read it. And she says to me, are you, because it's kind of a personal question, even though it's in the book, she said, did your therapist really say those words? I'm like, yes, she did. It is true. I mean, maybe she really did say it that way. And it's also an illustration of how uh, there are many ways to help other people, but that analogy made more sense to me than saying it's not your fault or uh, uh, it's not your responsibility. In those ways people would tell you, right? Or, just move on. But
Yeah.
sort of, or saying you're burdened by your parents. Well, yeah, I know that. But something about not just knowing the burden, but the burden can be given back to them. And so, uh, yeah, that's helped me a lot.
So another thing you touched on in the book was something I wasn't aware of about how trauma can be transmitted from one generation to the next through genetic changes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you
Mm-hmm.
share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's something called epigenetics. Um, I first heard about it. It was probably during that year, but I was listening to Krista Tippett, the On Being Project, and she interviewed a psychiatrist, Rachel Hada. Um, and what's really interesting is she had done a study where she went out to study. Her parents are survivors of the Holocaust. They went out to study the survivors of the Holocaust when she started to get requests from the children of the Holocaust survivors to say, but what about me? And she's like,
Mm, mm,
you didn't, I mean, I'm making sort of light of it. You didn't go through the Holocaust, so why am I studying you? But they would say, I can't sleep. I can't, so the first thing was the understanding that there were people coming to her. In one article I have in the bibliography, a young a man who was a very wealthy, well-to-do financial banker who was the son of Holocaust survivors wanted to tell her that, sort of like I described in the book, no matter how much this is going on, I can't sleep. I'm haunted by, anger. I'm haunted by whatever. And so they began to study why, particularly when they couldn't say that that person had experienced a direct trauma.
mhm,
And
mhm.
what they've come up with is, and I can't explain biology very well, but it's part experiential, right? They're experiencing their parents' PTSD and the parents sense that something's going on. So there is an experiential component, but epigenetics is more this concept of things being switched on and off based on life experiences. So
Mm.
the best way and the simplest way to say it is if you maybe multiple people have a predisposition or a gene location for depression, right? But there's something about the environment has to switch that on
Mm.
because some people will be depressed and some people won't. So it's the same thing apparently with this PTSD symptomology. Um, you, they're describing it as maybe transferring the propensity for low cortisol. Cortisol is what's used to help control stress hormones. So
Mm.
when you're stressed, your cortisol should also go up because the cortisol is the balance to it. Everything in your system is supposed to be balanced. But she went on to study pregnant women after the trade centers came down. And the babies were being born with low cortisol
Mm.
because the mom had experienced the World Trade Center thing. And
Wow.
so I think that is
Wow.
biologically still trying to understand it. But what they
Mhm.
first was they witnessed it. They saw it. They could not account for any reason for them to have PTSD symptoms except for their parents. So
My
isn't that
goodness.
fascinating?
It
It's,
is. I
it's,
never was aware of that before. So thanks for sharing. I was like, oh my
yeah,
God.
and that's why my parents, having come out of my
Yeah.
grandparents coming out of the Irish Revolution, and my dad, literally, his dad died in the bombings
Mm.
in World War II Italy. They never talked about it.
Mm.
He never talked. Now you're like, oh, that's why. He was
Mm.
traumatized, but he doesn't tell me he's traumatized. He doesn't know he's traumatized. He knows he doesn't want to talk about it, right? So
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think it's very interesting.
Wow. You also talk in the book about how chaplain training is evolving away from some of the ways they used to be done to new approaches.
Mhm.
What's a quick summary of that?
Yeah, the quick summary is that one, and none of this existed in 2017, the methodology. People really wanted chaplain to be somewhat scientifically based. In other words, the interventions you use, the approach you use, they can sort of by research show it has a particular result. So scientists, not scientists, but chaplain researchers are researching different components of the way you ask a question, the way you enter the room. But in terms of trauma-informed care, I mean, I got a syllabus. I was supposed to be the learn about trauma by, and there was nothing on the syllabus, right? Even as recent as 2017, people didn't understand it. Now it's exploded since then, but there's more and more training with chaplains, with pastors about the need to be very, it's not really an approach, it's an awareness. Like that when I talk to you, Brian, I should first assume that maybe you've had trauma. So I'm going to be quiet. I'm not going to try to re-traumatize you. I'm going to let you lead the conversation. I'm not going to be very inquisitive, but it allows us to, the goal being never to re-traumatize someone who's been traumatized.
Hmm.
And now there are many more teachings about it. It's being incorporated into chaplain education,
Hmm.
as opposed to hiring a former pastor, giving them some training, and let them be pastors. So that's the sort of long and short of it.
Cool, cool. There's a theme that shows up both explicitly and implicitly throughout your book, that God is present through us. God uses us to be his hands and feet in the world. And I just think that's such an understated topic in religion.
Hmm.
The idea that it's up to us, as Buechner would put it, to be Christ to each other.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think I do believe we're in a joint expedition with God, right? I'm actually a member of a denomination that calls himself Christian Church of Disciples of Christ, but God did say they'll know you're Christians by your love. But there were so many times that in a room, of course you're doing your preparation, right? But in a room, I go in thinking, I know whatever, this person has had a serious injury or the family's distraught that someone's dying. And words would come to me that, I didn't pre-prepare them. And even as I'm saying them, I'm like, I have no idea where this is coming from, but it met the moment, right?
Wow.
And it happened so many times that after a while, it couldn't feel coincidental or accidental in a way. So I was learning more to just keep that space open
Mm,
that
mm.
we, in a different kind of life, we might call it intuition or uh, instinct. But in those moments, uh, I talk about baptizing a prisoner. I never asked anybody if they wanted to be baptized, but I was available if somebody said they wanted to be baptized, right? There was something about what was happening there. It popped out of my mouth before I said, do you want to be baptized? And I'm like, I can't believe I asked. I'm not very evangelical in my approach. And then he said yes. And then this sort of really transformational thing happened about it. But that was not my idea. That came from somewhere else. That's what I mean by that.
Very cool.
Uh,
Very cool.
yeah.
So another thing you talk about in the book that you say, as I now recognize, I survived my childhood trauma because I constructed a purpose in life.
Mhm.
That's very powerful. Do you have any advice for people as to, how they can kind of discern such a thing for themselves?
Sure, and they probably have in some way. They may not realize it or not, but all resilience studies are about um, being forward looking, right? And so they might call it planning, uh, adaptability, but the way we can do it is to really, I think, understand what your core values are, right? Um, Somewhere along the line, it's not really in the book. Even at 6 years old, I said that when I asked what I wanted to do when I grew up, apparently I said I want to help people. So it was kind of, I don't know whether I was given that as a way to survive, but we all do it, and most of that involves maybe it's a personal goal like a marathon, but maybe it's a uh, just a generalized goal to interact with people, and you can do that through participating in community, not isolating yourself, making plans for the next day. And if you don't have a large sense of it, it's getting out of your comfort zone and saying, no matter what, I'm going to call this person for dinner and I'm going to go to dinner, right? So even if you're lonely and not feeling well, you have something in the future to look forward to. So it's about putting things in the future that you plan for.
Mm,
I
mm.
began to learn, and maybe I can do a whole separate study of this, but when people
Yes,
came in and
yes.
uh, they survived accidents, and we did a little bit of recording this because we were supposed to look for PTSD symptoms. Not me, but the trauma team knew that they are eventually going to be opening that door. And what I found was patients who woke up and said, why did this happen to me? Tended to be more likely to be having nightmares in the hospital and
Mm,
PTSD symptoms than people who woke up and they'd be like, oh my God, I survived. I've got to testify to this. I've got to be a witness to this to people. And that's a future oriented thing,
yes,
right?
yes,
I am going to
absolutely.
reconstruct this bad event. Uh, Not that it didn't happen to me and I almost died, but as something else. So it's creating a different narrative that moves them into the
Mm.
future. And boy, would I like to do a study on those two questions.
Yeah, boy, the power of
Yeah.
planning for the future.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I did my whole life. I always knew I was the kid who knew what they wanted to do when they went to school, knew they wanted to be a lawyer. So everything was geared towards making sure that that happened, right? But that allowed me not to stay stuck in certain moments that are described in the book and feel totally sorry for myself. I'm not saying
Yeah,
that I
yeah.
have
No, I
never
mean,
felt sorry for myself. I have, but you can get out of it a little better, you know.
same
So
with me. I
yeah.
was kind of a plan for the future kind of a person, but I didn't really realize the, I'll say, side benefits or hidden benefits of that you're describing.
Hmm.
Very cool.
Hmm.
Well, we
Yeah.
could go on for hours talking about this wonderful book. I really, again, appreciate so much that you've done it, Ellen. Again, the title is Walk With Me, A Journey Through the Landscape of Trauma. Please go check it out and go to Ellen's website, ellencorcella.com. That's ELLENCORCELLA.com. So, Ellen, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for going through all the work that it took to create this book. A lot of people are going to really appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you for all you've done for writers across the spectrum of the businesses and things that you've done. You've encouraged people to write, right? And we need at least all writers need somebody pushing them at the back, and
Well, thank you.
your companies were part of that. So thank you
Thank
very
you. It's
much.
been my pleasure.
Okay, very good.